It didn't begin with polite negotiations in Washington. It began on the streets of Accra. Picture this: market stalls, half-empty mothers counting their last coins to buy a small bag of rice, fuel prices doubling within weeks, and young men wandering aimlessly because factories had frozen hiring. The Ghanaian cedi was collapsing, and with it, the dreams of millions who once believed their country was the shining example of economic stability in West Africa. By late 2024, Ghana was no longer a story of promise, but of panic. Debt had swollen beyond 85% of GDP. Foreign reserves could cover barely 6 weeks of imports. Interest rates on government bonds skyrocketed above 30%. For ordinary families, this wasn't about abstract percentages. It meant skipped meals, unpaid salaries, and a terrifying sense that tomorrow could be worse than today. And then, like a rope thrown to a drowning swimmer, came the International Monetary Fund. A $367 million disbursement, sudden and dramatic, meant to stop the bleeding. But here is the haunting question. When the IMF steps in, is it really saving a country, or is it tightening the leash? For decades, Africans have whispered the same warning, that each loan is less about stability and more about dependency. Ghana's crisis forces us to confront a deeper reality. Can a nation ever be sovereign when survival depends on the signatures of foreign institutions? And if even one of Africa's strongest economies can fall so fast, what does that mean for the rest of the continent? So I ask you, has Ghana truly taken its first step toward independence by admitting past mistakes and embracing reform? Or has it simply walked into a more polished form of control? Please share if you believe Africa deserves to control its own destiny, free from cycles of debt. And subscribe if you believe that truth must always speak louder than power. The crisis did not appear overnight. It was the result of choices reckless, short-sighted, and wrapped in the fever of politics. In 2024, as Ghana approached its elections, the government began spending as though money had no limits. Subsidies multiplied, public salaries were hiked, and construction projects were promised in every district. To the average voter, it felt like a golden age finally arriving. Roads were being paved, social programs expanded, and politicians spoke of prosperity just around the corner. But economists warned it was a time bomb. Beneath the surface, the numbers were spiraling out of control. Ghana's debt ballooned past 85% of GDP. Nearly half of government revenue was devoured by interest payments alone. Instead of building for the future, the state was borrowing from it. The election campaign became not just a contest of ideas, but a contest of spending each promise more expensive than the last. The results came quickly. Bond markets, once eager to lend to Ghana, lost confidence almost overnight. Yields shot beyond 30%, a signal of panic from investors who believed the country could no longer pay its bills. The national currency, the cedi, began a free fall, losing nearly 20% of its value in a matter of months. For a country dependent on imports of fuel, medicine, and food staples, that collapse was devastating. The cost of transport doubled. Electricity tariffs surged. In rural villages, mothers found the price of cooking oil had tripled compared to the year before. Behind the statistics lay human stories of quiet suffering. Teachers reported delayed salaries. Civil servants who once relied on regular paychecks faced weeks, sometimes months of waiting. Contractors who had financed government projects with borrowed money found themselves bankrupt when the state could no longer pay them back. Market vendors in Kumasi whispered that sales had dropped by half because families could no longer afford even small luxuries. The sense of dignity eroded as quickly as the value of the currency. Foreign reserves, the nation's financial shield, thinned to barely 6 weeks of import coverage. Imagine the fear of knowing your country could no longer afford to bring in food, fuel, or medicine beyond the next month. Banks began to tighten lending, worried that liquidity was drying up. Small businesses, the lifeblood of Ghana's economy, suddenly had no access to credit. Shops closed. Construction sites fell silent. The entire system felt like it was grinding to a halt. And all of this unfolded while Ghana was technically under the protection of the IMF. The country already had a 36-month, $3 billion extended credit facility in place. It was supposed to act as a stabilizing anchor. Yet the spending spree of 2024 pushed the program to the brink of collapse. The fourth review, critical for unlocking another $600 million, stood in danger of failing. Without IMF approval, the funds would be frozen, and Ghana would have faced the most severe economic shock in decades. The irony was cruel. A nation once praised as a beacon of fiscal responsibility in Africa suddenly stood as a warning sign. Investors asked if Ghana, even under IMF supervision, could fall this far. What chance did other African nations have? International confidence, once Ghana's strongest asset, evaporated. On the streets, the panic was palpable. In Accra, long queues formed at gas stations. In Takoradi, families rushed to buy rice and cooking oil before prices rose again. In marketplaces, traders argued with customers over sudden price hikes. And everywhere, the same question echoed: how did we get here so quickly? This was not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It was about sovereignty itself. When interest payments consume your budget, when bond markets dictate your survival, when your currency is at the mercy of foreign investors, what independence remains? Ghana, a country once seen as the future of West Africa's stability, was now staring into the abyss. The government faced a brutal truth: unless it changed course, the nation would not just endure hardship, it could collapse entirely. And that realization set the stage for the dramatic pivot that was about to follow. At the height of the crisis, Ghana stood on a knife's edge. The IMF's extended credit facility, the 36-month $3 billion program meant to guarantee stability, was on the verge of collapse. Its fourth review had gone so poorly that $600 million in pending disbursements hung in the balance. Rumors spread that the IMF was ready to pull the plug, cutting Ghana off at the very moment it needed help the most. For businesses, it meant preparing for mass layoffs. For banks, it meant bracing for a liquidity crisis. For ordinary people, it meant hunger, unpaid salaries, and the terrifying possibility that the country could run out of imports within weeks. This was the turning point. Ghana's leadership, under immense pressure, made an unusual move in African politics. It admitted fault. In a televised address, officials condemned the reckless pre-election spending of 2024, calling it irresponsible and unsustainable. More importantly, they announced a drastic pledge, delivering a primary budget surplus of 1.5% of GDP, not in the distant future, but immediately. A strict cap on spending tied directly to actual revenue replaced the old habit of borrowing first and worrying later. The IMF listened. What could have been a death sentence turned into a lifeline. In a stunning reversal, the institution approved an immediate disbursement of $367 million. The decision shocked many observers who had expected punishment, not support. But the IMF made its reasoning clear. Ghana had taken responsibility, admitted mistakes, and committed to reform. That rare honesty earned trust. The impact was immediate. Within days, bond yields, which had spiked above 30%, eased into the mid-20s. For international investors, this was a signal that Ghana was not beyond saving. The cedi, though still fragile, found a moment of stability. Banks, which had been tightening credit, began to breathe easier. Local businesses, manufacturers, shop owners, service providers felt a cautious thaw, though the scars of panic were still fresh. But not everyone welcomed the news with relief. On the streets of Accra and Kumasi, small protests erupted. Fuel prices and food costs were still rising. Ordinary families, already exhausted from inflation, heard the IMF's conditions: higher taxes, strict audits, tighter spending, and wondered why they must pay for the mistakes of politicians. Contractors stood in limbo, waiting on delayed government payments. Public servants whispered bitterly about salaries arriving late, if at all. To them, the $367 million was not a lifeline. It was a reminder that their country's fate was once again tied to decisions made in boardrooms far from home. The political arena grew heated. Opposition parties accused the government of bending to foreign pressure, selling out sovereignty for short-term relief. Social media lit up with hashtags questioning whether Ghana was regaining dignity or surrendering it. For every commentator praising the leadership's honesty, another warned that the IMF's embrace was a stranglehold in disguise. Even the IMF issued its own stern warning: never again allow pre-election spending to jeopardize an entire economy. It was a message not just for Ghana, but for Africa as a whole. Leaders from Nairobi to Lusaka were watching closely, studying whether admitting mistakes could unlock trust or whether it only deepened dependency. And yet there was also a sense of cautious pride. Many Ghanaians, weary but realistic, acknowledged that owning up to past errors was a sign of maturity rarely seen in their politics. For them, this moment symbolized a chance, not a guarantee, but a chance that the country might finally break the cycle of denial and crisis. Still, the question lingered in every conversation: had Ghana truly turned a corner, or had it simply bought itself time before the next storm? For every point gained in investor confidence, there was a price paid by the citizen in the marketplace. For every dollar disbursed by the IMF, there was a condition that tested the boundaries of sovereignty. The high drama of the $367 million disbursement marked more than a financial pivot. It was a national reckoning, a moment when survival and dignity collided. And it set the stage for the next chapter, the painful consequences of austerity and the debate over whether sovereignty can survive when survival depends on outside approval. The IMF's $367 million disbursement may have stabilized Ghana's financial headlines, but on the ground the consequences were swift and severe. Every rescue comes with a price, and this one fell squarely on the shoulders of ordinary citizens. Almost overnight ministries that had once operated with unchecked budgets were shackled by strict spending ceilings. The days of freely approved projects were gone. Teachers, nurses, and civil servants who expected regular salaries began waiting weeks, sometimes months, for pay. Hospitals reported delays in restocking essential medicines. Contractors who had risked their own capital to fund government projects faced bankruptcy as arrears piled up. For small firms, unpaid invoices meant shuttered businesses, layoffs, and broken families. In the marketplaces of Accra, Kumasi, and Takoradi, anger simmered. The cost of food and fuel, already climbing from the cedi's collapse, crept higher under new tax increases designed to meet IMF targets. For families, the reforms meant harder choices whether to send children to school or keep them home to save money, whether to eat 2 meals a day instead of 3. What was presented as fiscal discipline in boardrooms translated into empty plates on kitchen tables. Public reaction fractured along painful lines. Some citizens accepted austerity as bitter but necessary medicine. They spoke of dignity in responsibility of finally facing hard truths. But others saw it differently. To them, the IMF's conditions felt like a foreign stranglehold, an intrusion that punished the innocent for the sins of politicians. Small but persistent protests broke out, especially among students and unions demanding relief from rising costs and denouncing what they called economic colonization. Placards in Accra bore stark slogans: "We pay, they borrow," and "Sovereignty is not for sale." The political cost was equally sharp. Opposition leaders seized on public frustration, accusing the government of surrendering Ghana's independence to foreign financiers. They warned that austerity would deepen poverty, weaken social safety nets, and ignite unrest. Viral social media posts painted the ruling party as puppets of Western interests, while memes mocked leaders for begging abroad, while citizens suffered at home. Inside Parliament, debates grew heated. Some lawmakers defended the reforms, arguing that short-term pain was the only path to long-term stability. Others demanded renegotiation, questioning whether sovereignty could coexist with external oversight. The issue cut deeper than economics. It became a question of national identity. Was Ghana still charting its own destiny, or had it ceded control to the IMF beyond politics? The strain on public trust grew more visible. Faith in government, already eroded by the reckless pre-election spending spree, took another hit. Ordinary Ghanaians asked why leaders were quick to make promises during campaigns, but equally quick to shift the burden onto the people afterward. In rural villages, elders lamented that the dignity of the nation was being traded for survival. The austerity ripple extended to Ghana's democracy itself. Analysts warned that sustained public anger could fuel populist backlash, where future leaders might rise not on platforms of discipline but on fiery promises to reject external control outright. That path, too, carried risks: isolation from global markets and potential chaos in governance. Yet even amid the hardship, some pointed to a silver lining. The crisis had exposed the structural flaws of Ghana's economy: over-reliance on borrowing, vulnerability to commodity shocks, and the dangers of unchecked political spending. For reformers, this was an opportunity to build a new foundation if the nation could endure the storm long enough. Still, the question hung heavy in every home and every parliament debate: was this austerity a step toward genuine independence, or simply another cycle of dependency wrapped in new language? For families struggling to put food on the table, that question was not academic, it was painfully real. While families in Ghana debated whether to see the IMF's hand as a lifeline or a leash, the rest of the world was watching with sharp interest. In Washington, policymakers framed the $367 million disbursement as proof that responsible reform could restore confidence. For the United States, Ghana's crisis was not just about one country, it was about the credibility of the global financial system. America, as the IMF's largest stakeholder, had a vested interest in showing that the institution still worked, that its rules could discipline reckless governments without driving them into collapse. But beneath the surface, there was unease. Critics in the US and Europe quietly admitted what African leaders had long said: the IMF's traditional approach often deepens dependency rather than solving it. By rewarding Ghana's honesty and reform pledges, the IMF appeared more flexible, but was this a true shift in philosophy or simply a cosmetic adjustment to preserve influence after all the fundamental structure had not changed? Ghana still depended on outside approval for survival. Sovereignty, once again, was conditional. Elsewhere in Africa, leaders studied Ghana's ordeal like a cautionary tale. In Kenya, Zambia, and Egypt, countries carrying their own heavy debts, officials debated whether admitting mistakes openly could unlock trust with international lenders. Some saw hope: if Ghana could regain credibility so quickly, perhaps they could too. Others saw danger: the political cost of austerity might fuel unrest, and in fragile democracies, unrest can topple governments. In Europe, analysts at the World Bank and Brussels think tanks praised Ghana's pivot as a sign that Africa was learning fiscal maturity. Yet those same voices avoided the uncomfortable truth that Europe too had benefited for decades from African dependency. Stabilized economies meant steady access to cocoa, gold, and oil exports at predictable prices. A Ghana in chaos threatened not only its own people, but also European markets and supply chains. Russia and China read the situation differently. For Moscow and Beijing, Ghana's crisis underscored the risks of relying solely on Western financial institutions. State media in both countries highlighted how quickly IMF conditions triggered protests, painting the West as exploitative. They pointed to their own loans and investment programs as alternatives without political strings, though many Africans knew those too carried hidden costs. Still, the comparison resonated. When survival depends on others, who you choose as a partner becomes a geopolitical act. For the African diaspora in the United States, especially older African Americans watching from afar, the story of Ghana stirred painful echoes. The idea that Africa's sovereignty could be bargained away through debt struck a chord with communities who understood too well the weight of systemic dependency. Online forums and churches buzzed with conversations about whether leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, who openly rejected IMF influence, represented a truer path to freedom than Ghana's compromise. Ultimately, Ghana's gamble sent a dual message to the world. To Washington and Brussels, it showed that flexibility and reform could keep Africa within the orbit of Western finance. To Africans, it reignited a debate: should survival come through negotiation within existing systems or through bold rejection of those systems altogether? And that is where the United States must pay attention. Because beyond the spreadsheets and bond yields, what's at stake is influence. If Africans believe that the IMF is merely a softer chain, they may turn elsewhere toward Russia, China, or their own regional alliances like the AES. For Washington, Ghana's moment is not just about stabilizing one economy. It is about keeping Africa in a system that America still controls. The world is watching. And Africa, though battered, is learning. Ghana's story does not end with applause or celebration. It ends with a fragile truce, a temporary calm bought at the cost of higher taxes, delayed salaries, and the quiet frustration of families who wonder how long they can keep tightening their belts. Yes, the $367 million lifeline restored a measure of investor confidence. But beneath the statistics lies the deeper truth: sovereignty that depends on foreign approval is never secure. This crisis is a mirror for Africa itself. It shows how quickly years of progress can vanish when political ambition collides with fiscal recklessness. It reveals the painful dilemma that nations across the continent face: negotiate survival inside institutions like the IMF, or attempt to build sovereignty outside them. Each path carries risks, each path demands sacrifice. And yet there are choices. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré has rejected the cycle of dependency altogether, nationalizing resources and building alternatives to foreign dominance. His path is not without controversy, but it forces a profound question: can true independence ever be achieved within the boundaries of systems designed elsewhere, or must Africa at some point chart a completely new course? For older Americans watching this story, it may feel familiar. Many of you remember the 1970s oil crises, the debt battles of Latin America, or the farm foreclosures in rural America. You know what it means when distant financial decisions shape the daily lives of ordinary families. The question now is whether Africa must remain trapped in this cycle forever, or whether a generation of leaders and citizens can finally break free. The warning is clear: if Ghana's reforms falter, if politicians once again use elections as excuses for reckless spending, the nation will fall back into the same pit from which it just crawled. And the world will shrug, calling it Africa's problem, when in reality it is a global problem of financial power and political will. So I leave you with this. Has Ghana taken the first fragile step toward lasting independence? Or has it simply traded one set of chains for another, this time polished, rebranded, and enforced through economics instead of armies? And more importantly, what lesson will the rest of Africa take from this? Please share if you believe Africa deserves real economic freedom, not just temporary bailouts. Comment below. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's bold rejection of external control offers a better path than Ghana's compromise? And subscribe if you believe that the truth must always be louder than the headlines. Because Africa's future and perhaps the world's balance of power may depend on which path its leaders choose next.